OT. Speech and language. Anybody? What else have we got? Anything else?
Pharmacy.
Which?
Pharmacy.
Pharmacy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Veterinary.
Veterinary?
Optometry.
Optometry.
Cardiopulmonary.
Okay. What else? Nice mix. All right. So, how do you feel about interviewing? Can't wait. Yeah. Right? Favorite thing to do. Most people will not say that. Why do we get rattled about this stuff? I'm sorry? Judgment. It feels like, yeah, how many places do you put yourself up for possible what? Rejection. When I asked that in group one time, somebody said, how about speed dating? Yeah, okay. But yeah, it's uncomfortable because of that whole feeling of, we're going to be, in some way a decision's going to be made about us, around us, right? So this is what I would say to you about interviewing. If you can convince yourself that if you get an interview, they've already deemed you qualified, and now it's just your chance to kind of, their chance to get to know you a little bit, right? And so think of it as a chat. Let's not use the word interview, because interview has all kinds of stuff attached to it, right? It's more of a chat for them to get to know you. And so the first thing I would say to you is that I'm going to hope that you don't take the typical action that we see, where people will try to guess what questions might get asked, and then they try to memorize responses. When they ask me this is what I'm going to talk about. Because you come across how? Canned, real canned. You've got to stay away from being canned. It's got to be a conversation here. So instead, tonight we're going to talk about 4 points of preparation that I really believe if you do these things, you basically kind of lined up your ducks in a row so that you can respond to whatever questions they present to you. Okay? So before we really get into the 4 points, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first 30 seconds of the interview. 30 seconds of the interview, what happens that quick?
Introductions.
Yeah, but I would tell you they've already made some decisions. So what kind of decisions are they making?
Personal appearance.
They're making decisions based on some of the things I hear you saying. What's the decision they're making?
Appearance.
You're talking about the things that they use to make the decision. What's the decision they're making? That fast. They often are screening people out. They don't screen people in that quickly, but they do screen people out, okay? And so that first impression makes a difference, right? So let's talk a little bit about the factors that play into those first impressions. What kinds of things are they looking at? You already started to talk about. What are they? Okay, so clothing, what do you think we're looking for here? A suit is probably best for all of these programs, right? So what do we mean by suit? You know, I don't think, I'm talking about women now, I'm not sure that you have to do the uniform necessarily. By that I mean when your friends are, interviewing with accounting firms, there's a certain expectation, right? You probably don't have to necessarily go that route. So you have some probably more flexibility. And color doesn't have to be gray, and blue, although that's fine if you're comfortable with that, that's okay. But I'm saying you probably have a little more flexibility if you want to, as long as it's not far end. So, know the colors that are good for you and go with the more conservative end of the palette. So for me, I've got grays and blacks over here, and I've got fuchsia over here. Probably would not be fuchsia for me, right? But a medium blue or gray, forest green, green, forest green, or medium kind of blue or whatever I would do. So looking professional, right? What else do you think they're looking at? It's all nonverbals at this point.
Body language.
So yeah, okay. So like what?
Your posture.
Posture. So can you overdo posture? We want good posture, right? But you can overdo it. So typically there's going to be a table in the mix. We do encourage people to use the table to your advantage. That means scooting up to the table, getting your hands above board, i.e. on the table, right? And realizing that you can use your hands. A lot of people think they're not supposed to move their hands, so what do you do with them? We get them clasped, usually under the table, or white knuckling the arms of the chairs. Right? And we do a practice interview in the Career Center, and I have a swivel chair to put you in, right? And so guess what happens in those chairs? A lot of movement, right? When hands get out, the chair stops. So I really believe that if you use your hands within the box, it's going to serve you up. It takes care of some nervous energy, and it gives you a little more personality, right? So you just want to make sure when you're using your hands that it makes sense with what you're talking about. And you don't allow yourself to get into one of those, have you ever seen somebody that moves their hands the same way no matter what they're saying? Except when they get worked up about something and the hands go faster, right? But that's not what we're after. But if you're, counting something off the list and you're doing that on your fingers, that's okay. It just adds to your conversation. Okay? All right. What else about first impressions? What are the factors?
Eye contact.
Eye contact. So what's good eye contact? How would you define it?
Maintain it, but don't keep staring at them.
Yeah, so it is eyeball-to-eyeball connection, right? But you could overdo that too. So in our business, everybody looks away, hopefully, In our business, we call that breaking away. And the reason we do some of that is physiologically, you try to screen out some of the sensory input so you can maximize what you put out. So breaking away is a good thing until someone breaks away too much, right? Have you ever seen somebody that doesn't really make the eye contact? So they're maybe glancing to the floor or the ceiling more than they look at you? Or the ones that make you really crazy are looking over your shoulder, right? You want to know what's going on back there? Not good, right? So I would encourage you to kind of check yourself day to day. And if you think you break away more than you should, a way to practice some of that out is to just break away to another part of the face. So glance into the cheek or the chin, come back to the eyes, is a way to get rid of some of that. You don't want to overdo it because we're not trying to get creepy with, too much of a lock on that eye contact. If you're in a committee interview, what do you do with eye contact? Shift it. So what does that look like? 2 seconds on each. Okay, so let's say I'm interviewing with the 4 of you. And I'm going to try to make sure that I include all of you and tell me how you think I'm doing. If I move it around, is that working for you? Too fast. All right, so let me connect with each of you as I'm talking, and that'll make it feel a little bit better until I get on to swipe 2, and then you realize that I just slowed down the fan. Right? So instead, what do we need to do? You got to move it around, So people say, well, don't you respond to the person that asks the question? And that would seem to make sense, except in a lot of times in these things, one person might kind of dominate, and so they're asking most of the questions. So I'm really connecting with you, and we're going back and forth, feeling good about it. When I leave, I'm happy, and you are real happy, and your friend over here says, I don't know if I could, I don't know if I can deal with this person. Why? Can't really even tell you. Just didn't have a good feeling because I didn't include you in the conversation, right? So you got to move it around. So I might start with you, and as we're connecting there, before I move down the line, I'm going to glance over this way, maybe make a connection, and then maybe it's a glance this way before I come back here, right? So move it around. Do you have a chance to practice that anywhere? Day-to-day conversation, or when you got the choice to do the class presentation or the paper, pick the presentation. It helps you develop skills you're going to use later on, right? So it's a good place to practice. All right. Okay, so that's kind of the nonverbals. Let's talk handshake now. Handshake, single most important factor in reading self-confidence. And so what makes for a good handshake? I'm sorry?
Strong but not crippling.
Okay, and what else did you say? She says strong but not crippling. What does that mean? I don't use the word firm, and I probably would put strong in the same category. People think that means you're supposed to hurt people. That's not really what it's about. It's supposed to be a greeting and make people feel welcome, right? And so I use the word sincere. You should feel like you mean it. So we're not looking for a floppy handshake, right? Not good. You hear what you get from me? Not much, right?
Right.
All right. So if we get in there pit and pit and wrap fingers around the back of the hand and a couple of, you did, right. You did a good job. I was trying to
thanks.
demonstrate that I wanted you to go, ew, you know. So yeah, it's really just something that I think men have grown up doing. You're pretty comfortable with a handshake. Women, a lot of times, you know, I mean, it's not something we do all the time. And so I'm going to encourage you to, you know, line up your friends, let them know you're going to when you see them over so many days, right? And just get that practice so you don't think about it. Okay? So pit and pit, fingers around the back of the hand, and a snug but not crushing handshake. Whose hand are you going to shake? If you have to go to an interview where there's several people interviewing, meaning a committee interview, several interviewers, whose hand are you going to shake? It's good if you can greet each one individually, yeah. And what I mean by if you can is if you're in a small conference room with a great big conference table, I don't mean that you should try to, you know, climb over the backs of chairs. That's probably a bit much, but if you can move around the room comfortably and do that, it's a good thing. Okay? All right. Questions at all about nonverbals? All right, let's get to the 4 points of preparation. Interviews often start with a very common opener that people have trouble with. What is that? Tell me about yourself. Why do you have trouble with that? Why is it tough? So it feels like bragging? Yeah, so we struggle with that. And what else? What's the other factor that makes it tough?
You really don't know where to start.
Not sure what to include, right? So how far back do I go, or what kinds of things should I really be doing here? What I'll say to you is that interviews really don't have much of an agenda here. If you ask people why they use this, they typically say things like, well, we're just waiting for the person to settle in a little bit before we really get started. I would tell you, if you know what to do with it, you can have an impact on where the interview is going to go. So where most people who have not really prepared anything will give us usually about 10 to 15 seconds and then they turn it right back to the interviewer, I would say you missed an opportunity. Okay? So I want to give you kind of an outline to help you think about what you can do with this. With really two goals in mind. One is to start selling yourself as a candidate. So a lot of what you talk about might be right in your application. And you probably have heard it said that in a lot of cases, especially with med schools, they're doing blind interviewing. What does that mean?
Interviewer hasn't seen your application.
Yeah, they don't have nothing on you, right? And so I would treat every interview you ever do going forward as if they have nothing on you. Don't make any assumptions that they've already heard this, okay? What you're doing really is helping you take the important stuff off that paperwork and start connecting with your face. So all of this is fair game. So you're going to sell yourself as a candidate with this first statement, tell me about yourself, and you're going to set them up to ask you questions that you want to answer by introducing them. So let me show you how you can do that. We're essentially looking at 4 parts that we would cover all 4 parts in about 2 minutes. So, and I don't mean that you have to stretch it to 2, but I'm telling you, you've got plenty of time to get quite a bit of information here. Okay? So, when we look at this, the last 3 parts will sell you as a candidate. The only reason the first part is here, and we'll call that personal history, is because if you launch into the rest of it without this, it's going to feel a bit like a hard sell. And so we're trying to make it a little more conversational by throwing in the history. Now, what do you talk about in personal history? What you don't talk about are the areas that are protected by law because of discrimination. And there are several of these, but there are 3 that people tend to mention here that we would say stay away from. So what are the ones that you think we hear people mention?
Religion.
Religion's one. So we used to call them gender factors because we thought women got in trouble over family, marital status of kids. And then we realized from an employment perspective that, anybody can get in trouble with that stuff because it impacts healthcare costs. And so maybe I'll look to get somebody who's single instead, right? Because again, that stuff going on. So staying away from that. And one more. What's the third one that a lot of you will mention that we say don't?
So you're saying like if you're married, don't talk about it?
You say don't make it the first thing out of your mouth. Okay. There are times where it may be supportive to something you're talking about, and to use it in a way to support something you're selling yourself on. So if you were talking about wanting to work in a setting that was around kids, and then you have kids, and being able to talk to, being able to relate to parents, that's a different story. Okay. What's the third one? Age. Why do you mention your age? So let's stay away from that. There are other protected areas, but I've never seen anyone sit down and say, you may have noticed I'm Caucasian. They're just not ones people mention, okay? So what do you talk about? A sentence or 2 about where you're from. Works pretty well here. And the only thing I have to qualify there is that if you were born outside of the States, your origin, your national origin is a protected area too. So if you feel like they may discriminate on you, against you based on that, you don't have to mention that. But barring that, sentence or 2 about where you're from, works pretty well. Then we get into education, so it's right off your resume. Where did you go to school? What kind of degree? Kind of meaning Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Arts, kind of thing. Major, minor. When you'll graduate or do graduate. So as a zipper looking at your resume, quick overview there. And then my question to you would be, do you have anything that you're wanting to talk about related to your education in some detail? And if you do, I'm going to encourage you to use a teaser statement here. It's just what it sounds like. You're going to tease them into asking you about it when you finish a couple minutes. Make sense? Now, some things don't need teasers. So if you said to me, I'm here at Grand Valley with a 4-year scholarship, when you're talking about your degree, you can say that. But you don't need to tease it because there's nothing else to say about it, right? Teaser is for things that are going to, you want to get some conversation going on. With me on that? Okay. So I'll give you an example, and I'm going to give it to you from another field, which I do intentionally because I don't want you locking into my phrasing. Some of you are going to talk to the same recruiters, or in this case, what? Admissions people, yeah. So I work with all health programs, but I also work with K-12 teachers, so we'll do one from education, okay? So, teaser, somebody's talking about their education and they say, let me give you the elements first so you know what we're looking at. 3 elements here to make a teaser work well. One is that it's short enough that you haven't told us so much that we're going to feel like we've already heard what you have to say here. We won't come back to it, right? So it's usually going to be one sentence. And then the phrasing needs to do two things. One is to show that you care about this thing. So you have to, there's usually a little bit of an emotional charge there, right? You got to sound like you care about it. And you want to plant the question. So it's got to be phrased in a way that they're going to feel like they want to hear more about this. So, if a teacher were here and said, I think one of the best things I did while I was at Grand Valley was to get involved in a research project on classroom management techniques, and I've been amazed at some of the results I've gotten with those ideas. Do you think that would be enough for them to want to hear about that research? Yeah. Okay. So, it doesn't have to be an academic thing. We're talking about stuff related to your education. Maybe there's some leadership role you want to talk about, or you tell me a trip that you took, a medical trip or whatever, right? With me? All right. Then you do exactly the same thing with experience. So here, it's kind of a quick where and when you've had whatever experience is. And this can be, I mean, it doesn't have to be jobs. It might be volunteer things you've done or job shadows that you've had. So quick where and when. And then think in terms of teasers. Is there anything that you want to tease about any one of those so that you can have more conversation? Not that there should be a teaser on every experience. That would be a bit much. You're going to have to kind of pick and choose. See where we're going with that? Okay. And then part 4 is personal qualities. Personal qualities are characteristics or traits. And so we really have to say it's really not part 4 here. We got to write it down somewhere. But if you just give a list at the end, that's going to sound pretty contrived. So instead, we're trying to build these into other things you're talking about. And this is not a place to try to get in every characteristic that you ever could think of about yourself in one statement. We're talking about maybe if you have a statement, there might be 2 or 3 of these. Okay? So let me give you an example. If somebody were on education, I started to realize how detail-oriented I am when I got involved in a project this last semester on whatever. That's going to imply that you're taking detail orientation into this new setting. With me on that? Okay. So we're kind of sprinkling those in through the statement. So after I said don't memorize responses, I will say that when I use this technique myself, I do actually sit down and script this. Because I don't think teasers just happen. You have to kind of train yourself to do that. My point overall is that you can't practice every question that might come up to the point where it won't sound canned. But you can practice one and get it down so that it sounds real good. You know, you can get to a point where it's conversational. So that means you got to go beyond just thinking about this and running it in your head and get the phone out and watch yourself do it as many times as you need to until you're happy with what you see. And the reason I say that is because I guarantee the first time you physically hear this, you're not going to like what you get. Even though it's been sounding really good in your head, first time you hear it, it's not going to be quite what you expected. So practice it enough so it'll be good so the first time isn't when you're sitting in front of somebody. Okay? Questions about this? That's your first point of preparation.
Is this 2 minutes for all 4 of them? Okay, that's what I thought.
Go ahead.
So if you have like a nervous stutter,
Yeah.
how do you go about that? Like on your, do they deduct because of it, or?
So this is what I'll say about nervous stuff. Everybody is nervous. It only becomes an issue when that's all they see.
Okay.
So the first thing I'd say with a question like that is, come in, let's do a practice interview. Let's see what's going on. And, you know, you may be your own worst critic on that. It's not that much to worry about. And maybe we'll have some suggestions too, depending on what we see going on. So, okay? All right.
You said you mentioned when you graduated. Isn't that kind of like seeing your age? That's pointing out that you're right out of college.
So, well, maybe. I mean, you know, we just don't want you to sit down and say I'm 22 years old.
And then if you graduate early, is that like you're more immature, or is that not the point?
So how would they know you graduated?
I mean, you mentioned like.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, to me, I don't know. What do you think? If somebody said that they were able to get through college and, you know, if you have a good GPA and in spite of it, would that be a bad thing? That sounds like a go-getter to me.
I've heard mixed, like with medical schools, are you pre-med? Or are you?
Yeah.
I've heard mixed things, like, one of my advisors told me that, like, some medical school interviews see it as like a negative trait, just because they think that you're like rushing through it, and, I don't know, maybe not taking
So if
the
you
time
finish
to-
in 3 years and you've got the low end of GPA, it probably doesn't help you that much, right? But if you finish quick and can, you know, say you got a competitive GPA, we'll call it, right? I would see that as a plus. You know, you never know what's going on in the interview side. All you can do is present your case, right? So. All right, anything else on this before we move on? Let's go to the second point of preparation. Those would be the questions that get at your motivation. Why do you want to do this thing? So, why do you want to be a doc? How did you land on PA? What drew you to our program is really a why do you want to be a doc question. So I hope you'd be talking about that first and then talk about why that program. Later, if you're looking for a job, what's your interest in this organization? I hope you'd be talking first about why you want to do this kind of work and then why with that population or in that setting, right? So they're motivational questions, and you probably heard people say, you can't say I love science, I want to help people. You heard that? Okay, that's a shallow response, right? Truth is, both of those things are legitimate if you know how to present them, okay? So let's just talk that through, because there's really a wide range of info that you can draw from to make your case about why this is a good match for you. So we talk in terms of your interests, your career values, and your skills. And I'm not saying that you have to have something from all of these areas. All I'm saying is think broadly so that you can go beyond the standard response of I love science and I want to help people. Okay? So let's just walk you through that. The interest, the easiest way to think about interest around school subjects. So that is the science angle. And or maybe some other sciences depending on what kind of function you're talking about. So what I mean by that is if you're talking OT, particularly, psychology has been part of that. So it wouldn't necessarily be just the hard science, the hard sciences, the soft sciences might play in as well. With me on that? Okay. You can't just say I love science though. You have to be talking specifically about which ones and why and how you see them tying in. Why they're relevant, right? Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Career values are the factors that you would point to that make this type of work rewarding for you. And yeah, you heard the word values. These are different from person to person. So what you cite as being a plus, something you really like, the next person might say, that's the one drawback for me. That's the part that I don't like. So there's no right answer here. It's really about what's important to you. So, what kinds of things play in? This is the helping people, category. But again, you'd have to talk very specifically about the kind of role you see happening with whatever discipline you're talking about, right? And how it's helpful to people. You have to be specific if you're going to talk that angle. Other things can fall into the values realm too, and I'm not going to tell you that these apply or don't apply to the field you're looking at, but just to give you an idea of the kinds of things people point to when they talk values. So things like having to think out of the box to solve problems would be a values factor. Tangible results. Can I see something happening because of what I'm doing? Right? Sometimes people are looking for some kind of social justice. And some organizations may be able to do that. So it can be lots of different kinds of things. You tell us what makes it rewarding. Okay? And then we talk about skills. And when I throw the word skills out, my guess is that you think of only one of three types of skills that we try to identify. So to keep this simple, we put this on a triangle, and in real simple terms, we talk about the things you know, the things you do, and the things you are. Okay? So the things you know are what you think of as skills. They're the things that you've studied or been trained in. So honestly, for the field that you're headed to, you've got some of that, but most of it's going to come once you're in the program, right? So we don't really try to push these all that much. I mean, you've got anatomy and physiology, that's a knowledge base that you may have to get on there a lot. So you've got some stuff. But most of it, you don't know how to do sutures yet. That's coming later, right? Things you do are ing words. And these are skills that can be really developed in a lot of different kinds of functions. And so in our field, we call them transferable skills. So there may be things that you're developing through that job delivering pizzas that you're going to be able to bring into this setting. See where I'm going with that? Okay. So think in terms of ing words, so things like planning, collaborating, communicating, active listening, evaluating, assessing, documenting, supporting, or motivating. See where we're going with that? All right. And then the things you are back to these qualities we were talking about up here. The characteristics. So are you detail-oriented or organized or perceptive? Or you tell me. Okay? Now sometimes they can come out of more than one category. So you might say organizing is a skill, or you might say you're organized, and it doesn't really matter how you're presenting that. It serves the purpose. Okay? Now, when you're thinking in terms of making that connection between you and the field that you've chosen, lots of ground to pull from. Okay? So you'll have a unique response here. So that's your second point of preparation. Third point of preparation are the skills, strengths questions. Your strengths are really your skills. So it's taking us right back to the triangle. So again, you can hear a lot of variations that get at these same things. So sometimes it's straight up, what's your greatest strength? It's a little tougher when I say, what are the 3 things you're bringing with you to make you good at this? A little tougher. Okay, 3. I've heard somebody say they were asked for 10. Okay. If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? Where does that fall in the triangle? We said your strengths are your skills. There you are, yeah. So if you're going to talk about being an oak because of its strength and broadness, you have shoulders that can carry the weight that you're faced with at this point. You're going to. Let me say this: we encourage people to take the time they need to think before they speak. So I just threw that out there real quickly, but I bet if I thought about it for a second, I'd come up with some better connections between American, what those characteristics might be. Are you with me? So take the time you need to think in an interview. Studies tell us that between 3 and 10 seconds is considered pretty typical for good responses. And candidates get real rattled about even 3 seconds. They feel like they weren't quick enough. And interviewers say, I think she had a good response here, a thoughtful response. All right? So give yourself that time to think. All right. So, on the sidetrack here, let's see. So we're talking about strengths and coming out. Okay, so this is the exercise to prepare to do that. And let me say before we even say that, don't wait for the question about your strengths to start talking about the triangle stuff. Your skills should be, sprinkled throughout the interview. You're going to draw from the triangle as often as you can. So, prepare to do that. The exercise is to sit down and just actually brainstorm a list of the things you know, the things you do, and the things you are. And then, you can't just say what sounds good. So what do you have to do here? It's the second part of this exercise, so that you'll be ready to talk about your strengths. Think of a good example for each thing that's on your list. The best example you can come up with. And realize that you can go to other parts of your life. You're at the front end of your career. It doesn't have to come out of, a healthcare experience that you had. You can talk about, if you're trying to make a case that you are, understand the importance of confidentiality and back that up by saying that you dealt with keeping records for your student group, financial records for your student group that often had to approach people with confront people for to collect from them, uncomfortable situation, but also did it in a confidential way. You could use that to support the fact that you understand what that means in a health setting as well. You see where I'm going with that? So you can use examples from other parts of your life. All right, so that's your third point of preparation, right? And the fourth is going to be having good questions for them. So I think one of the handouts that just came out to you was a list of questions, or did it? No.
You can pass them around though.
Okay. We were just talking about that. There are lists of questions out there. But this is what I'm going to say to you. It's going to be a lot more impressive to them if you can develop your own real questions. I used to give a list of questions, and then I had an employer say to me, this was many years ago, how come people always ask the same questions? And I said, well, what are you going to ask? And they honestly were coming right off the list that I had. So you can Google for these lists, and that feels like you just ask questions because somebody told you you're supposed to ask, right? What you really want to do is to demonstrate that you're thoughtful enough to be thinking this through. So base them on the real, based on what you already know, what are your real, next logical questions, right? So much more impressive if you can, maybe refer to something you saw on their website that made you wonder about this. Okay, now it feels like, checking it out. Make sense? So the best questions are going to be open-ended, meaning they're not yes or no, and they're going to be neutral, meaning you haven't led them to the point that we already know what you're hoping we're going to say. So as you ask those questions, and you get their take, their response. If you want to affirm something you're hearing, it's okay. I'm glad you're here to say that because blah, blah, blah. And, maybe you've got some light thinking on that. That's okay. But don't lead the question with telling them how you feel first. Okay? Okay. So how many questions should you have? Okay. Yeah, 3 or 4 good questions. And as long as you have something that feels professional, like a leather look pad holder, when you come in to do a practice interview with me, if you remind me, if you don't have one, I can probably find one for you. Okay? Yeah. A new one. I think that sounds like I'm going to dig in a closet somewhere. No, a new one. But anyway, you can have this written down. And so what we see a lot is people might have 3 or 4 good questions, and then you have a great conversation, and a couple of those have already been answered. Now you can't think of the third one for the life of you, so you say, I don't have any more questions. It's going to be a lot better if you check your list. It'll help you remember that third one. And even if they've covered everything, it's going to be better to say, no, I think we covered everything I wanted to talk about. Based on looking like you were prepared, right? Then you just say, I don't have any questions. Now that doesn't give you permission to use that without really having any questions, right? But it's much better if you can ask a couple questions. Okay? All right. So how are we doing? 4 points of preparation. If you do these 4 things, you are now prepared to go in and have a nice chat with somebody and not worry too much ahead of time about what those questions are going to be. Okay?
I have a question going back to like a question like the tree one, when you need like a couple seconds to think about what you're gonna say. Do you have any suggestions for what to do, and do you say something in response, or do you just sit there quietly?
So remember that the typical think time is 3 to 10 seconds. And so if it's a question where you're not feeling like, oh, where do I start with this? You don't have to ask for any permission. You don't have to stare at somebody while you're thinking. It's fine to break away and just kind of gather your thoughts and then come back as you start to respond, okay? When it's a question that you're feeling like, ooh, like where do I start? It's okay to use that, that's a big question, let me just think that through. Kind of, it buys you a little extra time.
Okay,
but I'm hoping you don't have to use that maybe more than once in a minute. Most of the time you don't need it, right? Save it for when you're really feeling it. Okay? So,
yeah. Do you have along with that, like the skills or strengths, along with weaknesses, I guess, like
Oh, weaknesses are important, okay.
I've heard people say like, oh, do something that counts as a strength and a weakness, but I feel like that's kind of tacky sometimes.
So I'll give you my take on strength and the weakness question. I think there are two angles that people use it. One is to present something that you're framing it as a weakness, but you're hoping they're going to see it as a strength instead. And if you read books on how to interview, a lot of times this is what they suggest you do. So we hear themes. We hear the workaholic theme that is usually based around, take on too much. So you're hoping they're thinking, well, it's good you're ambitious. We hear the perfectionist theme. Can be hard on myself when things don't go as well as I want them to. Well, you're going to have high standards. Well, that's a good thing, right? Or I get too emotionally invested. So even when I'm away from that thing, I can't stop thinking about it. We're glad you care though, right? So the problem with these is we hear the same ones over and over again, and it doesn't matter, even if they're true, it's going to sound like it's coached. So I don't really encourage people to go this route. I think you're much better off if you can talk about a real weakness, so there's no plus angle intended there, right? But you need to be able to talk in specific terms about what you're doing to get better at that. So it can't be, I'm working on it, I'm aware of it, I hope I'm getting better kind of thing. It's got to be, I'm doing this and this and this. It's good if there's a couple hands in there. Sounds like you're really tackling that. Because in doing that, you're now demonstrating to them that you look for places to improve and you actually do something about it. Now, first thing we're going to say there is don't confess something that's going to get you screened out. So this has to be something that is not, severe enough that they're going to say, oh, it's a good thing you told us now, right? So it should be, typically it's kind of on the minor side, but it's specific enough, it's concrete enough that you can talk about what you're doing about it. So if you put that on the triangle, because I would tell you that your weaknesses are going to come out of the same triangle, they're just the ones you're not good at, right? Which of the three do you think it would be easiest to use the technique I'm talking about? We're going to talk about the steps you're taking to get better. Things you know, things you do, or things you like? What's that? So a lot of people say that because it sounds like the action one, but think about it. Usually the most we can say about it is I'm trying to get into more situations where I can practice that. They come with practice, right? So it's hard to say I'm doing this and this and this. Things you are really tough because people say I'm aware of it, I haven't written it, they can't really identify what they're doing. So it's usually a knowledge base, honestly. Some concrete thing we can grab onto that you say, this is something I've wanted to know more about, and so I started doing some research on it. You got to talk about what's the resources you're using. So I read this, great book, and his website, maybe call my name. Don't just say I read a book and saw a website. You got to be specific about those resources. But also be prepared that they might ask you something about it, especially if it's a topic they have an interest in, right? So don't just say you're doing it if you're not really doing it. With me? Okay. Does that help? Who asked about weaknesses? All right.
Do you have any techniques for interview anxiety?
Interview anxiety?
Yeah,
Is that what
you
said?
get a little nervous, you just do breathing exercises or something.
Well, yeah, so there's always that stuff, and that's, we've got a great counseling center that does that work, so I would encourage you to talk to somebody there if you want to, about some of those techniques. I think people do better when they feel like they have prepared and they realize that every word does not need to be perfect. If you can convince yourself this is just a chat, it's a conversation, it's going to feel better to you. And the long and short of it is that's all it really is, right? So, I do want to talk about one more thing before we break. Was there another question back there?
It's okay.
So, just to mention behavioral-based interviewing, because I think it's very common, and how it's different from situational interviewing, okay? So behavioral-based interviewing is where the question itself is asking for an example, okay? and you're expected to kind of tell a bit of a story here, okay? Different than the way we were talking about using examples earlier. When you're talking about these things out of the triangle, we want you to just throw these quick examples in. Don't wait for them to ask for an example, right? Now, the basis of the question is an example. So they are the tell me about a time kind of questions. So, tell me about a time that you were involved in a situation that didn't go well. That could be just about anything, right? But they want to hear the story. Okay? Have you ever been involved in something where you demonstrated initiative? That's a tell me about a time question. If you put tell me about a time in front of it, you probably got one of these questions, right? So to respond to these, we encourage people to use what we call a STAR approach. And we put 2 R's on it. So what you're doing is setting up what the situation was and or the task that was at hand. You're identifying what your action was. And it's got to be your action. You know, a lot of times I hear people talking about something that they did as part of a group. And so there's going to be a little bit of we did this and we did that, but within that, you got to talk about what your role was, right? And then we used to stop with the results. We just had the 1 R. And we realized how often people were not hitting what should have been part of the results. So we threw the extra R on there to remind you to do what? Can you guess what that is? This reflection, yeah. So all that really means is that you have to give meaning to why you're telling the story. So if something that didn't go well, the result was it didn't go well, right? You can't stop there. You're going to talk about what you learned from it or how you might handle it differently next time or whatever, right? If it's a chance to show initiative, you might not have anything that looks like healthcare at this point, but maybe it's something with a student group that you can talk about. You just need to bring it back and tie it into how you think it might apply in that setting, you know, or the fact that you're comfortable with stepping up when you need to meet those needs here as well, right? You see where I'm going with that? You need to make the connection close the loop. So I want you to be aware of that, and I will kind of distinguish that from situational interviewing. Situational interviewing is where they set up the situation and say, what would you do? And what I'll tell you about those is that I think a lot of times your first thought is, wow, there are so many factors that I have a million questions here, right? And so what do we try to do? When it's not clear, there are so many different factors that could play in. What the mistake we make is we try to answer in a way that's going to cover every base, right? That's okay if you're doing a multiple mini and you got 10 minutes to talk. It doesn't work so well in a one-to-one. Okay, so this is the strategy I encourage you to use if it's more of a one-on-one where you're not going to, you know, if you talk for 10 minutes in a one-on-one, that's going to be should be a conversation. So this is what I encourage you to do, is to acknowledge, well, there are a lot of factors here that I think would make a difference in how I'd actually respond. But if we can assume for a conversation here that these things are true and lay out what, you know, a scenario that way, then you can say, in that situation, this is how I would carry through. See where I'm going with that? So that you can at least grab onto this thing. Otherwise, you're going to be all over the place trying to respond. Multiple minis, you can do that because you got time. You know, to kind of hit several different angles. So just FYI, who knows? So was there a question back there? She's still there? No. Anybody else? Did the sign-up sheet make it all the way around? Okay, good. We do a practice interview in the Career Center, so if I can help with that, we'd like to do that. You can just call the office at 331 3350. Yes. And they can help set that up. I'm in Allendale and downtown both almost every day. And my friend Stephanie is going to be helping with these as well. So if I'm not available, she will be in my turn. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.